All right, we're a few minutes past the hour. We have a lot to cover today, so let's begin. My name is Lisa Osipenko, and I head Consilium Scientific. Today we have a very special event for you. No slides. We're welcoming Dr. Nancy Olivieri, who is the professor of pediatrics and medicine and public health sciences at the University of Toronto. And your Nancy's story, it deserves a movie. And actually, the one already came out. If you watched Constant Gardener, you won't believe it, but Nancy has something to do with that. And the amazing book by John Le Carré, the Constant Gardener. So, but the story is much, much bigger than that. So, welcome to, I would almost want to say this book club, because Nancy is actually writing another book and she'll tell you all about that. So let's begin. So Nancy, my first question to you, please try to, in this incredibly long story, to give us the introduction in 10, 15 minutes. What is it all about?
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me today. I'm really pleased to be here. Yeah, as we were just saying, it's a 30-year story and nobody wants to inflict 30 years of slides on people, which I'm sure you're all happy about because it's way too boring to say then 2002 and then 2009. So we're not going to do that. I'll give you the bones of the story because it kind of is a story and then it kind of fades for a little while. And then there's a more exciting or more dramatic coda that's lasted another 15 years. So back in the 80s, I designed a trial, investigator driven, with my colleague Gary Brittenham, who was then at Case and now is at Columbia. And we designed a study of a new drug, and we made the drug at U of T, and another company encapsulated it and blah, blah, blah. And we gave it to patients and it looked promising. And in 1995, we published those promising results in the New England Journal of Medicine. But before that, we had gone to the FDA and they said, you need to get a drug company involved. They'd said a couple of other things, but that was the kind of the crisis. And we were introduced to Barry Sherman of Apotex, which is a Canadian generic company that had never before developed a drug. We joined forces with him. He gave us some modest funding for a couple of the trials that we were running. And about a year and a half later, we recognized that the data showed that the drug was not working effectively in reducing iron. This wasn't an interpretive dream. This was related to numbers. The level below 15 milligrams per gram dry weight liver tissue is the threshold for cardiac heart disease and early death. And patients were exceeding that. So Gary and I looked at each other and we said, oh, we'll just tell the company. And the company said in a dramatic letter that if you tell patients, parents, regulatory agencies, or the scientific community about these findings, you will be served with all legal remedies. And I was at the Hospital for Sick Children at the time and the University of Toronto. And to make a long story short, they were anticipating the largest donation in the university's history from Barry Sherman, who was a very, very wealthy man, probably the fourth or eighth most wealthy man in Canada. And he had been dangling this donation in front of them, and they did not, related or not, take any of these violations of academic freedom or scientific integrity seriously. And the long story was that in the short story, I guess, right now, because it's kind of compressed, in the next 3 years, I was fired several times. And I had 4 colleagues, Brenda Galley, John Dick, Helen Chan, and Peter Dury, all of whom kind of ruined their lives for me. When I say they didn't really write a letter and then go away, we spent hours and hours and hours of time together, writing letters, defending ourselves against the harassment from Sick Kids Administration and the university administration. And finally, I think at the 3rd or 4th firing, my colleagues from Boston and Oxford came over and up to Toronto and brokered a settlement with the University of Toronto by which I was restored temporarily. The harassment intensified at that point, and mediation was followed by settlement, followed by violation, followed by settlement. These were pretty dramatic aggressions. I was referred to the College of Physicians and Surgeons with the intention to revoke my medical license. This, as we discovered through Carl Elliott's writing and others, is absolutely routine. Like if she's a doctor, send her to the college to remove the license or the GMC or whatever. There were a lot of financial impositions. We had to use lawyers on our own money, where, as pointed out by David Healy in a couple of articles, the administrations of the hospital and the university used some of the most expensive lawyers in Canada on taxpayers' money. So we were in a very unequal playing field for a very, very long time. And things didn't really unheat, but they kind of went underground for a while. People returned to their work. I was restored to my work. And I moved hospitals to the University Health Network, which is a critical point in this story. And then in 2009, I'm sure I've missed stuff. Maybe I should just back up and say that I learned from a brown paper envelope that Apotex Sherman was trying to get the drug licensed in Europe using my data, but had claimed that I had falsified the data and it should be ignored. My problems with the drug should be ignored. So I had Graham Dukes, who some of the people on this seminar will know, review my trial, do a forensic audit of my trial. And he found that, what were these people smoking? There was no violation in the primary endpoint, and the trials were robust. So in any event, the EMEA licensed the drug as a last resort drug in 2001, I think. But we had spent 5 years by that time at the European Court challenging Sherman. And I guess it was the first time that I realized the regulatory capture, which goes on and on. So to move quickly to regulatory capture in 2009, I get a call from the FDA, who has been told an identical story, that my trials were rigged by fraud and misrepresentation. But this time the FDA is sending an inspector. Now, everyone knows that FDA inspections are rare, and foreign inspections, in Canada, for instance, are even rarer. And they came up. The inspector spent 5 days recognizing that all the data that I'd kept preserved for 13 years after the termination of the trial, Sherman had terminated them back in 2006, was completely intact, and he was able to check every single clinical research form and correlate it to the data which Sherman had allegedly had told the FDA, and the recognition that 43% of the data were misrepresented became clear. So the FDA, the inspector went back to the FDA and shut down the application for 2 years. Contemporaneously, though, probably the same month, I was fired from UHN with the explanation that corporate UHN thinks you're trouble. Who fires people like this? Anyway, I say to the guy, well, that's really not a very effective way to fire them, because now I'm going to go back to my office and write that in a letter, and it's going to be trouble for you. Anyway, they then parachuted in an individual who began to give the drug, still unlicensed in Canada, and at that time still unlicensed at the FDA, to 3/4 of the locally transfused patients. And I began to hear about this because patients would approach me at Starbucks, because by then I'd lost my office, and I would sit there and drink coffee and work in the atrium at the UHN, and they would say, am I supposed to be on this drug? And I said, well, I don't know what's going on. So I went to the research ethics board at the hospital, and no one would give me any information. And this is when Brenda Galley and I joined up again. And we finally wrote a paper published in PLOS 1 in 2019 that showed that there were many, many complications arising from this administration of unlicensed deferiprone, that patients had died, that diabetes, which was an old complication of iron overload. So you can't, and that used to happen. Yeah, it used to happen back in the 80s when we didn't have an effective drug. And it almost disappeared as a complication. And liver injury had happened. So we wrote this paper, and we thought that would get an investigation from the UHN, but the UHN commissioned an internal, conflicted, confidential, and inexpert inquiry and said that this was standard of care. So that's what I mean by the CODA starting again in 2009. So we've spent this last 10 years trying to get the patients to be informed of what had happened to them on an unlicensed drug. It would never been a clinical trial, although that was alleged for years. There had never been, to my knowledge, and I went through every chart, every page of every chart, a consent form in that chart. And a couple of the patients later on, when the PLOS 1 paper came out, said, yeah, I don't think I signed a consent form. And I said, yeah, okay. So that is essentially the story. It's checkered by a lot of, yes, John Le Carre heard about a particularly interesting part of the story that we can talk about. There was a lot of very, very effective opposition. Story's a bit of a nightmare, probably less of a nightmare than many whistleblower stories in medical research, because I had such support from my 4 colleagues and from one ethicist in Canada, Arthur Schaefer, and by a number of people internationally. And the reason for that was that I wasn't that young when all this happened to me. I wasn't starting out. I had already been an attending for nearly 10 years when this happened. So I had my old mentor in Boston, and I had my current collaborator, Professor Weatherall in Oxford, and they comfortingly were shocked by all this, absolutely shocked. I mean, so were Gary and I, but then we just thought, well, as soon as we tell the people about the data, everything's going to be clear. And I mean, we just couldn't have been wronger about that. And so there was some help. And so I didn't completely lose my job. I lost my position, and I wasted 25 years of work that we're still trying to get back onto, John Dick and myself, with Brenda as well. And so it was kind of a terrifying example of the encroachment of pharma. But, pharma is not the really big bad deal in this story. Of course, it's a big bad deal. But, the enclaves that were supposed to protect scientific integrity and academic freedom just weren't there. I should actually mention one other thing, or two other points, is that the Canadian Association for University Teachers was a very, very strong advocate for academic freedom, a remarkable organization. I've never met another national organization like that. Was led by Jim Turk. And for absolutely the same years that I was struggling, the 18 years that Barry Sherman was suing me, he was there supporting. And the other organization that was phenomenal was the University of Toronto Faculty Association, led by a guy named Bill Graham, who had also been at the CAUT. And his famous line every time you got discouraged was, "Oh, no, it's much worse than you think." He sort of knew the story and knew the whole climate of things well before I did. Chance favors the prepared mind, and he was quite prepared for all of this. So he fought like crazy, even though we weren't officially University of Toronto Faculty Association members. He made us members, and then he defended our academic freedom, even though I was just a clinical faculty at one of the affiliated hospitals. So what happened was the drug, I always get asked this, was the drug licensed? The drug was licensed in 2000 or 2001 after our court case was thrown out on standing, not merits. So the judges in 2003 considered the case and decided that I wasn't a patient or a European, and I had no standing to bring the case against them. So they allowed the drug to go forward as a second-line drug. When the FDA discovered the ruse in 2009 and Sherman's disclosures that did not happen to be corroborated by the data, they shut the investigation, they shut the application down for 2 years. And then the next, in 2011, they licensed it as last resort therapy, because by that time, another drug company had come up with an orally active chelator, iron drug. So iron chelating drug. So it's been licensed. The story of its licensing in Canada was quite locally explosive. I won't get into, but it's worse than the licensing in Europe and in America. As far as what's going on now, there is still, talked to my lawyers twice this morning already, still have them. I have a firm which I've been working with for 28 years. I should have moved in. I mean, honestly, I owe them rent. And there was just, it's just ongoing, because these institutions have elementine memories, and they don't appreciate it, that line, corporate UHN thinks you're trouble. Well, you're always going to be trouble. So, I mean, there's just so much coming out of this. I guess what I should tell you about is John Le Carre, because it's more interesting than most of this. And he what caught his attention was that at the beginning of 1998, we began to receive anonymous racist hate mail. And to make a long story short, an investigation, the usual investigation, was launched by the hospital. It took 4 months, then it took 8 months, and then nothing happened. So Brenda Galley obtained DNA from the person we suspected from a licked envelope that we knew he had licked, and from one of the envelopes that had contained one of the hate mail letters to her. She sent it to a lab in California and identified it as the most respected, lauded, enabled scientist at SickKids, then Gideon Corin, who was then found guilty of professional misconduct. The next year, he was found guilty of research misconduct for taking Gary and my data and publishing it in a different form. And he received another 15 years of enabling and promotion at the University of Toronto and Hospital for Sick Children before the mother risk scandal occurred, in which he had been found to have perjured himself on non-forensic data that he called forensic and destroyed families and tore them apart. It's really not part of my story, but people come up to me every week and say, well, that did it. And it's kind of like Al Capone, you know, when he got dinged on tax evasion, not for shooting up the city of Toronto, but on tax evasion. So Corin finally left in disgrace and had to give up his license. Why do I tell you this long story? Because the hate mail attracted John Le Carre's attention. He read about it in the Times or the Times Higher and thought, that is one crazy hospital. So he decided to, and when I talked to him, I went on and on like this. And finally I paused over this long afternoon of tea and said, this isn't really what you wanted to hear, is it? And he said, this is exactly what I wanted to understand, because he didn't understand the positioning of the administrations of the hospital, he didn't understand how people kind of got fired and then their friends kind of join in and try to help them and it's useless. Didn't understand the regulatory stuff. It was really interesting. So the Constant Gardener doesn't tell the exact story, but in chapter 18, I'm the bitch in chapter 18. I'm the person who's relating the story of the hate mail. And the hate mail is identical to the Gideon Corin story. Well, I know that's pretty fast. I know it's probably.
Nancy, thank you so much for this overview. I'm sure our listeners have a lot of questions for you, so I'll try to start with some of them. So before we get into the legal issues on all the how you personally were handling all of that, can you give us a little bit more, maybe 5-minute overview of thalassemia and what patients had available back then when the whole
Yeah, it's
scandal
fantastic
started?
question. Fantastic
What
question.
is happening with them now? I think you explained where the product is positioned at the moment, but how crucial was that product for those patients at that time? And another related question, because you were obviously dealing with an academic trial for the drug sponsored by the company. Were there any other trials going on elsewhere, obviously
Okay.
sponsored by the
Okay.
company?
So,
And
so first of all,
yeah,
not sponsored by the company. Gary
okay.
and my trial argued about the endpoint, got money from MRC, got money from NIH, got money from a lot of charities. And when the paper had been published in 95, this is kind of far along development, Barry Sherman decides he'll invest in it. So not sponsored by the drug
Okay.
company. So
Thank you.
an investigator-driven trial. Back in 1982, I was young. I came to Sick Kids on a fellowship. I was still in my fellowship, and I took over the thalassemia program. In those days, people died regularly at 18 or 20. There was a 25-year-old woman in the clinic who people talked about in whispers because she had lived so long. It was routine to lose them. 60, maybe 70% of them had diabetes as a complication of uncontrolled iron overload, and most people died of heart failure sometime between 18 and 25. That was because the treatment then was a needle inserted overnight and taped in for 12 hours. And it was remarkably effective. David Nathan and David Weatherall jointly had developed this on both sides of the Atlantic, and the infusions absolutely reduced iron overload. So 10 years before 1982, there was nothing, and everybody died because they were transfused, and transfusions administer excess amounts of iron, which is toxic to the liver and heart. Mm-hmm. Desferol, the needle drug, the drug that needed to be infused, wasn't orally active, was remarkably effective and safe, but it was very difficult to use. And the holy grail was an orally active iron chelator. And when I read about it in the BMJ, I contacted people in London who were very determined not to work with me, not interested at all. And I went to the University of Toronto chemistry lab and said, can you make this? And my old friend Bob McClellan said, yeah, you could make it in your bathtub, except it's exothermic, so it would heat up your bathtub, so I'll make it free. It's the kind of guy he was. And then we got the drug encapsulated free, and then we got MRC money, and then we got Health Canada permission, and then we started the balance studies. Nobody else was doing this in terms of quantitating liver iron concentration in the liver, because that's the way Gary and I did it, even in non-trial patients at the time. And the liver iron concentration is quantitatively equivalent to body iron burden. Nothing else is. Everything else is a surrogate marker, and we didn't want to do sloppy surrogate marker trials. So we do this, And then we start the trial and it looks good and we publish. And that's when the FDA says, well, you need another trial in Europe. And I said, I know. He said, you need another trial. I said, I don't have any more patients. He says, we'll go to Europe. So Gary and I organized a trial in Italy, 3 centers in Italy. And we were scientific co-chairs of that trial. And that was the trial that was supposed to give the FDA information on safety. We can return to that trial in a minute, but that was run by us until Barry Sherman fired me and then Gary resigned in protest. So, so there were experiments going on, but nobody had actually quantitated the liver iron concentration. The liver iron concentration was the modality through which we said, geez, this is too high. The liver iron in this patient is too high. Okay, let's look at the next one. The next one was too high. And actually, there were some patients in whom liver iron had descended and then began to rise again. So we were concerned about that. So if you're asking me, did the patients have any life-saving therapy? They very much did. Desferalt was life-saving. And back in 1985, David Nathan and I published a paper that showed the cardiac disease-free survival was improved in patients who actually took the drug. Now, I'm not saying it was an easy drug to take, but parents of children complied 100%. It's only when they became adolescents that kids said, I'm not sticking that needle in me 12 hours a day. And that became a problem. Not in everyone, but in significant numbers of patients. So an orally active chelator. Now we fast forward to all the stuff hanging around the regulatory agencies, including when Sherman lies to the FDA about me. By then, already an orally active chelator developed by Novartis called Exjade had been licensed as first-line therapy, non-inferior to Desferalt, for 4 years. So the people wringing their hands at these FDA advisory committees saying they need an orally active chelator, there was already an active chelator because so many years had gone by and all this fighting and all this challenge. In the meantime, Novartis had brought up the rear and done a randomized controlled trial of 300 patients using liver iron concentrations and demonstrated their drug was not inferior to Desferalt. In fact, I've used that drug quite a bit in Sri Lanka. It's a good drug. I mean, it has problems. Every drug has problems. But my point is that if people wring their hands and said we needed an orally chelator, we didn't need an orally active chelator at the point all this was going on. But back in 1982 and 1988, when we started the balance studies, we did. There was no other drug, but there was a life-saving drug. I hope that's clear. It's a lot of
Incredible
history.
story. Yeah. Thank you so much. Very useful details. And can you tell us a little bit more about the patients? So, I guess what I'm trying to ask is, how did this work with patients wanting to be on this oral drug? How were they listening to you? Were they listening to the company? Where the patients came into this, and this is, I can imagine, very desperate situation for the parents of children and for teenagers, like you say, because they like you just described, that they didn't want to have an injection. Any comments on patients back
Sure.
then? And I would say now, what are the options for the patients now? Is the situation's better?
Well, let me deal with that first because it's pretty simple. Right now, there are 3 drugs licensed. Deferiprone is licensed, to my knowledge, in Canada and the US at least, as last resort therapy. The 2 first drugs are Desferalt, which still exists. It's used by a minority of patients who are kind of, I would say, the conservative element of it. I'm sticking what works, Nancy. I'm not moving off this drug. And I don't argue with that. Most of the patients, I'd say 70% at least, are on Exjade, which is an orally active drug, as I said, licensed as equivalent or at least non-inferior to Desferalt in 2005. In most countries. In Sri Lanka, where I work, it was 2010, but in North America and Europe, it was 2005. That drug is can be worked. Its problems can be worked around. It doesn't have huge problems. It's not for everybody. So there are 2 first-line drugs, and then there is a last resort drug. I think, although I'm not really on the inner circle anymore in any of this, that deferiprone is probably used very little relative to those drugs, except in Toronto, where it was used as a first-line drug while it was unlicensed in 3/4 of locally transfused patients. The latest scandal that I tried to relate. But to go back to your question about how patients felt, well, first of all, when I introduced this trial in a balance study, They were very keen, obviously, because, most of them were people who had not been taking Desferal on a regular basis or had been having difficulty with it. And they were like, oh my God, yes, sign me up. I said, well, you know, okay, but you have to go in the hospital for 3 weeks. I don't care. I don't care. So they were actually very, very keen. When Barry Sherman slipped the letter under my door that said you will be served with all legal remedies if you tell parents, I was a bit in a panic for about 2 minutes because I thought, you know what, I'm going to be sued with all legal remedies. But then I decided, okay. So I started to tell the patients. And most of the families with young children were like, we're going back to Desferal. I don't care what you say. If you're worried, I'm worried. I sort of thought that would be the case for most of the families. Of course, there were teenagers who said, well, can't you keep watching my liver biopsy? And, can you keep doing liver biopsies? And if I get into danger, and I'd say, well, you're already in danger. They say, well, I'm going to do it anyway. I mean, there are people who always go against medical advice, and that's their right. It's all consent. We had new consent forms because the REB at Sick Kids the REB had insisted that we revise the consent forms to reflect our risk absolutely correctly. So we revised it and said, you have to sign a consent form if you want to remain. But by that time, Barry Sherman stopped the trials. So we had to continue some of these patients on what's called, or used to be called, compassionate use, but they had to sign a consent form under that. So they had to say, I get what you're saying. I get what Dr. Brittenham is saying, but I'm going to continue the drug anyway. Now, that didn't continue very, very long. But in any event, probably because rapidly the patients became enrolled in trials to test the Novartis drug. Toronto was a site for those trials as well. And there was a lot of excitement because this was a new orally active drug, which turned out to work in terms of being adequately effective in most patients. So, I mean, it was a struggle. It wasn't a struggle. It didn't really surprise me that the teenagers and young adults were quite upset about this. Did they listen to the company? They certainly did, because as anyone who's on this Zoom knows, companies are good at courting patients, really good. And they were flown business class tickets to Europe and 5-star hotels. And there was, in what turns out to be my longest chapter of the book, something called profitable pretense, in which there were lots of myths made up. Because what happened was, when Gary and I saw that the drug wasn't working well, there were a couple of serious people around the world who hadn't done liver biopsies in their patients, but thereafter undertook. And they said, yes, our patients exceed the threshold as well. There were a couple of these people, some who went kicking and screaming into that, and some investigators who were very keen to find the truth. And so it became acknowledged that this drug did not reduce liver iron. So what Barry Sherman implemented was a myth that it reduced cardiac, heart iron. There's all kinds of colorful examples of how this was translated to the patients, including a 40-foot heart-shaped balloon with the name of the drug on it floating over a European meeting, just so parents and patients wouldn't miss the implication. This drug is the drug to save your heart. You'll recall that I said people died of cardiac failure, and that was still very much in the memory of many families. People knew people who had lost kids from heart failure, and they were terrified that that they weren't going to get the right treatment for heart failure. It was a really profoundly disturbing marketing, not that I'm the first person to observe this, to patients. There was a lot of buy-in by some of the patients. I would not say even close to most of the patients, but some significant leaders in the thalassemia community. And of course, the overwhelming support that the hospital administrations and the university administrations gave to Barry Sherman, the overwhelming support that the patient organizations gave to Barry Sherman, and Barry Sherman to them, gave him a lot of money, was a factor, because you look like kind of the person who's waving the flag, and but everybody else saying it's a terrific drug. It was quite a difficult kind of geometry, because the press, with remarkable exceptions, was very, very much lined up with the hospital administrations and the university administrations. And I think most of my lawsuits, believe me, most of my lawsuits were not Barry Sherman suing me, although he did. Many of my lawsuits were me suing the media, saying, you can't libel me like this. You can't libel me like this. Libel notice again, because they were absolutely relentless. And they do believe that you will never take action. Well, we took action. And every single one of our initiatives was settled successfully in mediation, including Barry Sherman's in the latter part of 2014, 18 and a half years after he'd first issued his legal threats. So it just took a long time, and for people to say, oh, it's really good that you stood up, and I'm sure everybody was with you. Hardly any of the press was, none of the administrations were. Most of my hospital colleagues, with the exception of these people that I've described, who are the heroes of the story, the real heroes of the story. I mean, they really ruined their lives for 25 years. So there's a lot working against you. And well, I guess that kind of answers the question of the patients.
Yeah, thank you, Nancy. So my next question is, I don't know how much the legal bills are in Canada, but considering what your lifestyle has been like for 30 years, imagining this in the US, it's not just being completely in debt and broke or having a sponsor. How did it work financially? How is it even
Yeah,
possible?
financially, it was very tough. I mean, there were then 5 of us. Nobody was rich. We had a lot of loans. We had these fundraisers that never really made much money, but they did make some money. We had, as I mentioned, the University of Toronto Faculty Association, and they had lawyers who, when I look back at the work they did, were probably working for pennies an hour. She would call me at 4 a.m. saying, okay, look, I looked through this thing by the dean wrote, and the dean, look at line 31, like really a very detailed, unbelievable set of lawyers. So we were partially helped by that, and by the CAUT involving their interests as well. Settlements helped. Our first settlement, I think, was the January 25th, 1999, returned some of our finances to us. By then we had spent twice what we got back. So we were always catching up. And again, it's not a level playing field because these people have the university had excellent lawyers and they dug in. So yeah, it was a bit of a financial nightmare. It always is. Well, we had a lot more help than most people. I hope I remembered, people made donations. My family helped, but they weren't wealthy either. And so, when people ask me, I don't think there's I don't know of any whistleblower organization that can actually take some of these cases on gratis. I would have said that the biggest help we had was through UTFA, because their lawyers were very, as I've said, prepared. They didn't say, gosh, this is a big surprise that the university is trying to crush your academic freedom. No. They knew it was coming before it came. And so they were extremely effective.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely fascinating. So what is going on now? Why are you still with the lawyers on the phone as of today? Because this sounds like history and you're writing a book. Where are things now?
Yeah, that's probably why the book isn't finished. Okay, that's a big excuse. The book isn't finished because I can't shut up about this. And people, my mentor in Boston, when I corrected him on something that was very minor, said, Nancy, I think it's possible that not everyone is as taken with the story as you are. When I told him it was a Tuesday and not a Wednesday. Well, what's happened is arising from the recent PLOS 1 paper, which isn't so recent, it's 5 years ago, in which the patients were harmed and deaths occurred. And we took that, as we had for many years before that, to the CEOs of the University Health Network. And they were like, yeah, we'll have an investigation. The investigation concluded saying that people were given the right drug and the standard of care. Now, if the right drug and the standard of care is an unlicensed drug that is last resort therapy in every other jurisdiction, not licensed in Canada and not licensed in the United States at the time, if the FDA is coming up with the fact that the CEO of the drug company is actually misrepresented 43% of the data, it's not standard of care. and people were harmed. And we are insisting that the patients be told that. In fact, in 2020, just as COVID broke, 88 scientists, ethicists, and researchers, many of whom I probably on this seminar, signed a letter to the University Health Network saying you need to allow Brenda Galli and Nancy Olivieri to tell the patients what happened to them. And to my knowledge, the patients have not been told or informed at all. And this is a real difficulty because, as I said, just to be clear, the patients were given a drug beginning in 2009. And in 2015, the drug was licensed by Health Canada. And I couldn't find anywhere on the Health Canada website that the many, many, many adverse drug reactions that Brenda and I identified and reported in PLOS1. And PLOS1 is an open access journal. So every serum ferritin and liver iron that you want to look up on that patient is on the data sheet. So that UHN could do nothing about the transparency of our data. It was all there and it's entirely correct. So I ask, I think what everyone would agree that he's absolutely the authority in drug policy in Canada, Joel Lechkin. So Joel, I can't find on this website, on the Health Canada website, any of the things that I reported in PLOS1. And he looked through, and I wouldn't even believe myself because I find Health Canada's website very difficult to navigate. He said it's not there. So there were no, when the drug was, by the time the drug was licensed on February 17th, 2015, Health Canada had not received the reports of the adverse drug reactions, the ones I later identified had occurred right through those last 6 years. In other words, to be clear, Health Canada made a decision on that drug without knowing the full harms and deaths that had occurred. And so this is one of the issues that I find problematic. One, that the drug, well, first, that the drug was administered without full informed consent. At least I can't find any consent forms. And just to back up 20 years, when Gary and I had suspicions that the drug wasn't working, the Research Ethics Board at Sick Kids said, well, change the consent forms and get a new signature. So here we are 28 years later, giving patients an unlicensed drug, not in a clinical trial without a signed consent form, kind of indicates that they didn't consent, at least adequately. So that's the first problem. But the second problem, to go back, is that Health Canada, to my knowledge, and thank God I have Joel on this, didn't know about it when they licensed the drug, didn't know about those problems. So that's sort of the fundamental fight that I'm in now, is informing the patients and making sure that the paper that has been published by the University Health Network doctors, the ones working with Sherman to get the drug licensed in Canada, is corrected. Because the paper they published 6 months after mine and Brenda's says nothing about the new diabetics, says nothing about the new liver injury, says undercounts the deaths. And it worries me that that paper is still standing in the literature. So yeah, I mean, I think, why do we tell these stories? Okay, this is really, I don't think anybody who knows anything about this story is terribly surprised. And as we see from Carl Elliott's book, there are worse stories and people just thinking, what the hell, something has to happen now, and nothing ever gets better. But I guess I tell this story because of the way I was in 1996. I really believed, what was I smoking? I really believed that I tell the story, and so did Gary Brittenham, that if we told them, that people would say, well, this is a bit of a pickle, but let's just straighten it out. And I want to say that we had at least 4 theories as to how to make the drug optimal. We thought we could increase the dose. It wasn't just the dose, though. It was co-administered. I won't bore you with all the scientific theories that we had, but Sherman shut down the trials because he didn't want to generate further negative data. And so the opportunity was lost to determine if the drug could have been a better drug. So then I realized that nothing happens to people who try to interfere with your academic freedom, nothing at all. Nothing happens to people who commit professional and research misconduct. And so if you tell this story to people, I'm sure they think, yeah, right, oh, sure. She must be some kind of crank. This can't be true, because I would have thought that too. And I think that the patients probably don't realize this either. And I think the general public, for all their cynicism about pharma, doesn't realize it either. I mean, I used to say things like, well, I guess the FDA will save us. What was I thinking, right? I teach a course called Health and Pharmaceuticals. I wanted to call it Health Despite Pharmaceuticals, but they didn't let me call it Health Despite Pharmaceuticals. It's called Health and Pharmaceuticals. It's taught to grad students and to fourth year arts and science students. And it basically has, I never talk about my own case, but the students look it up. But I don't have to talk about my own case because it deals with policy and the erosion of integrity at the FDA and regulatory capture and clinical trials and how busted up they are. And so, but I reach about 45 students a year. I don't really think the public knows anything of the depths of any of this. I would stand on a street corner and give out Carl Elliott's book if I could and make people read it. And I've done sort of the equivalent to that. I think, I made all the classmates, my medical school classmates that I'm in touch with, they all read it to great horror. But I think the problem is that we're all really old now and we're still reading this to great horror. And young doctors and young researchers really have no idea what they're in for. There is no protection. There's just an illusion of protection. And more importantly, there's an illusion of protection for patients in trials, about which many people have written. So I don't think my book is going to do anything. It's like a lot of better books have talked about the more general aspects of things. But I'm writing it because I was tired of other people writing about it, which I had to sue about, and many times, and just to get some of the worst stories in.
I have more questions for Nancy, but I'd like to ask the audience to raise your hand if you'd like to ask Nancy some questions. In the meantime, Nancy, when do you have the deadline to finish the book? I know it's not easy, but is a publishing house, when is it coming?
Oh yeah, they're not really happy with me. But you know what the hell? I mean, I can't get it to stop. I mean, if the story stopped, we could maybe wrap it up. Anyway,
But you can do like War and Peace. You can do the volumes, volume 1,
yeah, they're
volume
not
2.
that happy with the War and Peace model. I thought a 3-volume series would be great, and they're like, I don't think so. Yeah, I don't blame them, right? I mean, honestly, as my mentor said, not everyone's just taking with the stories. I'm trying to reduce it, but the problem is the stories, some of which are so funny, not funny, but unbelievable, that you just want to include them. I just have to resist that urge.
Yeah, but do you have a dream in mind? Like, is it going to come out summer of 2025, or what?
Well,
Is your?
that was sort of thought, but who knows? I don't want to say that because it'll just be.
All right.
Listen, I work on this
Keep
book
us in suspense. That's
Sure.
fine. That's fine. So yeah, people are suggesting you should do the Netflix series, which I think
there is a series in pre-production. There is a series in pre-production because a funny story was that a guy from Hamilton, I'm from Hamilton, Ontario, McMaster, and he was talking to John Le Carre one day, and John Le Carre said, because they were colleagues at Oxford, and he said, you should hear, this person's from your hometown. So the screenwriter for this, who's finished the screenplay, so yeah, hopefully, I mean, it's also called Blood Money. That's the name of my book, of my book in progress. The screenwriter is a phenomenal guy, and really got enveloped into this. So that's in pre-production. But again, he keeps saying, don't make sure this is in. Then he said, it's not a documentary. So it's kind of a dramatization more than a documentary.
Excellent. Yeah. So I'll be back in touch, making sure we get the book and the series on our website. So you'll have another pressure point. Another question that came up in the chat is, how did you manage the mental pressure and the stress, and how did you survive in terms of mental health dealing with all that stuff?
Well, you know what? I think it's a really good question. I think it's really, really sounds pat, but these people that were helping me, I actually had very good family support as well. But these 4. Now I'm not mute anymore, right?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So we would meet on a daily basis and often on the weekends, because the hospital was trying to, would fire me, and then it would do something to Helen, and then it would impose an imposition on Peter. And so it was a kind of a constant meeting, a constant dialogue, mutual support. That is unbelievably important. Most whistleblowers are all by themselves. And many of them have said to me, God, if I'd had those people, I could have gotten through. And it's probably true because they were unbelievable. And they didn't say, and Gary Britton would call me every single day. And I would wait for him to say, okay, I'm out of here. That hospital is insane. And I can't do this anymore, Nancy. And he never said that. Years and years and years. And so when Sherman would ask him, do you believe in what Dr. Olivieri is saying? He would say, oh, 150%. And they tried to get him to work for them. And he said, there's not enough money in the world to get me to do what you want me to do. Those are the kinds of people I had on my side. It was truly remarkable. You can talk about solidarity, but that was real solidarity. And these people were really, they were all incredible researchers and scientists. In Brenda's case, a surgeon on their own, and they all had to work around huge academic careers to do this. It wasn't 2 hours a day. It was 4 or 5 hours a day for many, many years. And, we didn't have any help from the ethicists of Toronto. That is my second longest chapter. Because and if you want to read anything about clinical ethicists, read Carl Elliott. They didn't see it as an issue at all. What the hell? Academic freedom and scientific integrity and the protection of patients in clinical trials, not an ethical issue. But Arthur Schaefer saw it that way at the University of Manitoba. And he basically participated in conference calls that went into 3 a.m. and fundraisers and speeches, and he got sued too. And so there was a real sense of solidarity, really, and the consensus that we were on the right side, and it wasn't that those colleagues of mine knew the data, except it was kind of easy to interpret the data because the data are linear. It's not like, I think maybe the liver iron looks kind of high. It is kind of high because we measured it in milligrams per gram dry weight. So we knew exactly where we could expect complications to occur, as we see in the PLOS1 paper 25 years later. So I'm actually more stressed now when it's a relatively isolated time and trying to get accountability, if not justice, for the patients who are harmed than I was in the day when we were in the eye of the needle, because it was a relatively new process then, and these people were indefatigable. It was just unbelievable.
For people in similar situations, and I'm sure you know the people, as you explained, who did not get such a support as you did, and I think it does. From everything you've said, it doesn't seem to me you were just lucky. I think you
Oh no, I was lucky.
arranged all these people around you in a particular way that you received all that support. I think it probably came both ways. But would you be able to give a bullet point advice to those people who, as you say, are left alone or don't know where to turn to or how to?
I tell you, the only advice I could give, well, I got lots of advice. One of it is never, don't tape record everything. It's so much easier now on cell phones. God, I wish cell phones had been around. We did tape things. We taped things down and we recorded to file. And I'd say the second thing is that you really have to be super outraged. And every time the National Post took a nasty crack at me, I sued them. I don't know how the money came from. Basically, we never got any big settlements, but we said to them, we're not going to take this. And that's very hard to do when you're alone. So part of that was that I wasn't alone. I think you have to be a pretty big extrovert in terms of trying to, Peter Dury stopped me in the hall. We were both McMaster graduates. We were friendly to each other at the hospital. We didn't know each other. He said, what's wrong? I said, what's wrong? Let me tell you. This was way back in the mid-90s. And he said, that can't be happening. I said, oh yeah? And then he tells me that I brought down 5 boxes of documents and plunked them on the table. And I think it's probably true that I probably did. And he read them all. In other words, you have to be ready, I guess, to push your problems on people who ask and not isolate yourself. It's really hard to do because you already are feeling isolated and put upon and bullied. There are now organizations, I want to give a shout out to Academic Parity, organized by Morteza Marmoudi. It's on Twitter at Academic Parity or something like that. And you try to listen to people. and they call you, and I always say, well, let's do a Zoom with Morteza, and we can give you some advice. And so, because even these small connections are super important. Mine were local, not so local, but 4 of them were local. And I think you have to have the confidence to just push it on people. And most of the time that's going to fail, and they're going to say, listen, I'm not dealing with this. Most people said that, but not these 4 and the others. So I think also, most of the whistleblower advice, which is good advice, is to don't do it if you think you're going to lose your job. I mean, I lost my job several times, and it was only really through senior interference that I had any job back at all. That doesn't mean, as pointed out by many better authors, that you get your job back. You get a format, you get your employment back, but you don't do what gave your life meaning. You no longer run the trials. I mean, in my case, I don't say goodbye to it with a lot of regret, because now it's all pharma directed, and I hated working with pharma, and I'd rather do my own investigator driven trials, and they don't really exist in clinical thalassemia anyway now. So everything's run by drug companies, and so I don't say goodbye to it with a lot of regret. But the point is that you lose the landmarks that gave your life meaning, and you have to find other meaning. And if you're not prepared to do that, it's very difficult to see why you would do it, because you're not going to win. I know this sounds terrible, but I would be inauthentic if I didn't say it.
Thank you, Nancy. Very sobering conclusion, because this,
Yeah.
the long, to summarize your story, it is in the end good versus evil discussion, and just saying that you're not going to win is very encouraging for the other side. But
I
I
hope it's
think,
not encouraging for the other side. I mean, they've got a fight on their hands, but you don't win these fights. The arc of the moral universe is long. It doesn't really happen. I used to have these fantasies about hitting it out of the ballpark. It was kind of a metaphor I thought in my mind. We're just going to clear that green monster, and then it's going to be, the ball. And I don't really think that way anymore, obviously, because I'm old and better informed. And so I think you can make small strides. And obviously, what choice do you have? What are you going to do? Go along with it and say, I don't think I observed this problem? You can't do that either. So I don't want to give any happiness to the other side. That would be the last goal I have in life. But I think it's realistic to say that, you do need to gather your resources. There are better resources now than there were then. The faculty associations come and go, but ours was just as unbelievable, as I said, that there are faculty associations that help support. And there are people now who one can call. This was kind of it was the early 90s.
you were the trailblazer for that.
Yeah.
So we have a couple of questions in the chat. If we can go through them relatively quickly, I think they're important questions. So one from Charlie Bennett: can you state something about Canada versus the US? And the US libel is not allowed except for very rare cases.
Oh, yeah. So, okay. So Canadian libel law is British law. And so it's very, I'm not a lawyer, but some of the libel involved an American company, and yet they settled. I mean, libel is libel. If you're a prominent politician in America, much more goes. Probably everything goes if you're a politician. Let me start again. If you're a prominent member of society, I'm not including myself in this, I'm including somebody who might be a writer, say, and they're libeled. The laws are very much more restrictive in Britain, and therefore in Canada, than they are in the United States, where the First Amendment protects free speech. But I don't know the limits of free speech, especially recently. So I would say that it's different, and that if somebody libeled, I really don't know how those cases would have turned out. Most of them were quite a long time ago. The cases I launched against the press and the media in general. And I think they were probably settled because the libel laws are more strict in Canada than they are in the United States. I think that's a safe answer. I don't know how strict or what small details would affect that, or if it's changing.
So it sounds like it's a good thesis topic for a PhD to explore. So US versus Canada. Another question is actually from Britain, from Peter Gordon, who was a psychiatrist at the NHS for
Yep.
25
Oh,
years,
Peter.
and says that marketing has not changed in terms of a pharma coming to the clinician. So marketing should have no place in education. What can we do about this, and why do healthcare institutions so diddly squat?
Well, you know the answer to that, Peter. I mean, the healthcare institutions get a lot of money. They don't, corporate UHN thinks you're trouble. Corporate UHN decides who's going to be on their banner because it is their banner. I mean, advertising is many forms, right? I mean, it's advertising to the doctor in the clinic, but it's also the way trials are organized now. And better people than I have written about this, how trials can be altered, but not just altered. It's not like they're shoving the data under the table. They construct, David Healy has written about this, they construct trials to design an endpoint like, do you have a maroon coffee cup? Well, that must be the endpoint of the trial. There's no real, surrogate markers are used. And this was something that was very prominent in our situation. People would say, well, anyway, there was a lot of problems in terms of the way the subsequent trials tried to disprove our original concerns. So they can, I think that in from my perspective, because I'm not a practicing general practitioner, is the main thing, is that they direct the trials, they run everything. It's ghost managed medicine, as Sergio Sismondo has written. It's all managed by pharma. And how we get out of it is, I don't know. I don't know how to divest ourselves of that, because the institutions, as I learned, if you had to ask me what was the biggest opposition to all this, were the administrations, who would always find a way to promote, enable, and encourage the other side. And so I don't know, that's a really inadequate answer, but you're absolutely right. Marketing, especially to patient groups, really sticks in my craw, because the patients really, really sign on to that. And if you're any kind of a doctor, you don't start advertising how great you are to your patient, but that is not, there's no limits on what pharma tells the patients. And it's always surprising to me how firmly they are believed.
Thank you, Nancy. So we're almost out of time, but I do have a couple more questions for you. So one is from Francois. How do you explain the failure of the worldwide pharmacovigilance system to identify the risks associated with defamation?
Well, I don't know what pharmacovigilance system you're talking about. What we have is a open access paper that lays out real life experience over 7 years of the drug, almost never cited, because aside from very few individuals, at that point, everybody in the field who was publishing papers was financed by pharma. I don't know what pharmacovigilance, how they could identify that if they didn't report that to Health Canada. And as I've already said, when the drug was licensed in mid-February 2015, there were 2 adverse drug events reported to Health Canada of those 6 years of exposure. 2 out of several hundred that we had documented by that time. That's why I was so incredulous and went to Joel and said, can you tell me what I'm missing here? And he said, you're not missing anything, it's not here. So I don't know what pharmacovigilance means if the drug companies do not report and the principal investigators do not report the ADRs. If it's buried in the bowels of the UHN, I don't know how anyone can vigilante that out of the bowels. I published what I could, and it's almost never cited. My feelings aren't hurt about that. I knew it would never be cited, but it's there anyway.
Thank you, Nancy. All right, to wrap up, I have 2 final questions for you. The first one, were you afraid for your life, and how often over the last 30 years?
Well, I mean, I guess I'm the kind of idiot who wasn't afraid of for their life. And it was always moving forward. But I do have a funny story about that. I mean, I adopted a baby in 2008, and I brought her home from China, and I'm sitting there, and a guy calls, unknown number, still on my landline, and says, you know, they're talking about killing you. And I actually said, listen, I really can't talk right now because I just adopted this baby. So I wonder if you could call me back. And my friend joked that I should say, listen, move death threats to line 2. We'll take them on a first come, first served basis. That was the only time we did trace that number. It was a legitimate number. It was coming from an authoritative source, but nothing ever happened. I'm obviously alive. Um, as far as, I guess I have to be honest that the events of the last 5 years, I think that that's no longer a danger. The company, which has since disbanded since Barry Sherman's untimely death. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that. Barry Sherman was the CEO of Apotex, and he was the one who met a violent death in 2017. And he, if there was any threat to my life, I think that it probably is over. But I really didn't think in those terms. No.
Thank you. And another question, perhaps a more difficult one. I know we don't choose, well, I don't know, but doesn't look like people cannot really choose their destiny. We make some steps that may shape some events in our lives, and then things happen to us. And to an extent, this happened to you, that your career, your life, probably when you were a medical school student, and if somebody fast forwarded to you your life to today, you were like, seriously? No.
Yeah. No,
So
that's true.
it is probably a very unexpected turn of events and turn of a career. And I would say a career because from everything you've just said, I'm sure you are a fantastic thalassemia doctor, you're an exceptional thalassemia doctor, but you shape the space as the fighter in this situation, and you are leaving amazing legacy to very, very different kinds of people, not just to thalassemia doctors. I would say to so many doctors, to so many students, to so many lawyers, whistleblowers, and other categories. So you, through your experience, you impacted incredible amounts of people far beyond healthcare, and that can learn from your story. But the difficult question is, if this didn't happen to you and you were a thalassemia doctor, what do you think your life would be like, or what would
I
you
thought
be
about that a
doing
lot,
your
actually.
time instead of talking to the lawyers?
I thought about that a lot. First of all, I think one, I was quite lucky in a way. When I look at my life now, the people I would never, I told this to my daughter the other day, she's now 17. I said, you know, you wouldn't know any of these people. You wouldn't know Joel. I wouldn't have known Joel or Dave Healy or Carl Elliott or Trudeau Lemons or any of the people that I now rely upon to say, what do you think about this? What do you think is right and wrong here? I wouldn't have known the difference between most of my colleagues and the 4 people that stood up for me. I wouldn't have known the difference between the ordinary ethicist and Arthur Schaefer. I would have lived a life that went along and said, yeah, that really couldn't happen. I would have lived a life that was really very ignorant and unexamined, actually. And I wouldn't have known I wouldn't have seen the mettle, METTELLE, of some of the patients, of some of the people who helped me. And in fact, at the same time, the whole thing in clinical trials shifted. We used to have a lot of fun designing our own clinical trials and arguing about whether this was the right endpoint or this wasn't the right endpoint. It wasn't like oncology. We were doing small trials in thalassemia. It's still an orphan disease in North America, but it was great. And it was great. It was really fun. It's not like that now. Pharma tells you what to do, and they practically give you the color of the slides you're going to present when you show the data. And you're thinking, I don't work for you. I don't want to work for you. So in the end, what shifted was the time of my life anyway. I came into medicine at a time where we were kind of more in control of our own destiny. But now the average guy thinks doing pharma trials is the real thing, and it ain't the real thing. So I feel like I lost it, but it was sort of gone anyway. And what I got was enormous cynicism and kind of feeling beaten down. And yes, I do feel that I would still like to be looking after patients. I get some of that when I work in Sri Lanka with our charity, but I miss that. But I think it's just become a different world. I didn't shape that world. It's shaped while all this was happening.
Nancy, not enough words to thank you. You're an icon. You're
Thank you.
absolutely incredible. And I would be dreaming of walking into the movie theater. I emphasize that I don't want Netflix. I want a proper film to watch you. And they might hire a few actresses, but you have to their 100%. So let's see if we can work this out. But yes, we're all waiting for your book. We'll be pestering you with that. So,
Oh
so you
God.
finish
Okay,
finish
thanks.
that. Thank you so,
Thank
so
you very
much.
much. It's been great. Thank you.
Absolutely incredible story. Massive applause. If you were, I think, in a big hall, we will be standing and applauding you.
Oh,
So
thank you very
thank
much.
you
It's
so,
really
so
nice to
much.
have been here. Thank you.
Um,
Thank you.
and we hope to have you back.
Thank you. Thank you very
Yes.
much. I'd love to come back. Thank you.
All right, everyone, have a good evening, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Thank you, Nancy. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye, everybody.